Okay, we are live here. Okay, I think we're good. Think we're good. Okay, so welcome back. This is episode 2. So if you've been on, or if you were on last time here on YouTube, we did an episode on chaga mushrooms. And chaga was the last podcast episode that we were going to record for our podcast, but now kind of on like the lost episodes. So not sure if I'm going to make this like particularly just audio yet, but it's going to be here on YouTube. And right now, I'm also recording it on IG Live. So, hello, I got you there. The full recording is going to be saved. It's going to be on YouTube. So, today, our topic that we're talking about is pesticides. So, did you know? Well, if you've been around here, you know that pesticides are a big issue. I've talked about them a ton on a variety of different channels. Definitely on IG if you follow me there. But did you know that in the US, more than 1.2 billion pounds of pesticides and herbicides are sprayed onto crops here in the US alone? That's crazy. And if you average that out, that means your average American is consuming roughly 5 pounds worth of pesticides a year. Sounds like a little bit of a problem because it is. So, with that, the interesting thing is there is a growing worry that there's a larger case of cancers that are coming about that are due to the direct consumption of pesticides. And how do we know this? We've seen this. If you've read the book, for example, the Monsanto papers, that would be a great place to start. But we do know that farmers tend to have higher rates of certain types of cancer, including lymphomas, leukemia, stomach cancer, prostate cancer, brain cancer, skin cancers, because just based on the nature of their jobs, they're exposed to them on a daily basis. Now, we know some of the most common pesticides that we know are uh, detrimental to humans. They're known as DDE, PCB, there's PCP, there's Dieldrin, there's chlordane. We're going to get into glyphosate. Don't worry, we'll get there, but that's going to be a little bit separate. That's got its own section because we have so much on it. And you may have heard of DDT. They used to spray it. There's pictures of trucks spraying children with DDT. That's a simple Google search. You could even find that. And you could, even though DDT was banned in 1972, you're talking 50 years ago, 50 years ago, and you could still find trace amounts of DDT on tubers. So things like carrots and potatoes that actually grow in farms. Pretty crazy. So, with that, it's especially it could be an issue for kids and young adults. Why? Because they're still growing, so they tend to eat more food relative to their body weight, and obviously, until they reach full maturity, their full height when they're done growing, they're going to be consuming more food per unit body weight. Also, their digestive tracts are growing, so it could be an issue, kind of growing. So when you're a kid, when you're a young adult, really important to be choosing organic foods when you can. So because of that, children also tend to consume higher amounts of pesticide residues, and this happens to be just based on the foods that they consume. So things like juices, stuff like that, tend to, especially if they're not organic, are going to be an issue when it comes to this. So University of Washington study found that they followed 39 2 to 4 year olds and they compared eating habits. So one group had organic fruits and vegetables, and the other had conventional. They found that the non-organic group, the conventional group, had 6 times as many pesticide residues in their urine compared to the organic group. And there has been, warnings sent out back as far back as 2000, talking about this, warning parents about the issues that could happen with conventionally grown foods, especially ones that are known to contain a large amount of pesticides, things like green beans, pears, strawberries, tomatoes, cantaloupes, and squash. So this brings up the question of genetic modification. So GMO. So a GMO, actually a genetically modified organism, is a plant, animal, or other organism whose genetic material has been altered in some ways that would not happen to occur in nature. Now, the idea with GMO crops was going to be to rid world hunger. That was one of the big goals when it came to introducing GMO crops. And there's obviously, there are studies out there now. If you kind of look deeper into this, we don't necessarily need genetic modification to grow more food as because we can actually grow enough food to feed the planet. It's more of a distribution problem. And we're seeing that now with issues in the supply chain, but that is a story for another day. Interestingly, what they find with these GMO crops is they are linked to more directly to things like IBS, chronic inflammation, and increased cancer risk. So, for example, we've talked about soy before. I'll do another deep dive on soy on here because I get that question all the time. So, GMO soy, genetically modified soy, which again, if it's conventional, you're going to be having your pesticides that you use in conventional agriculture and include things like glyphosate. The conventionally raised soy has been found to inhibit some enzymes that are responsible for limiting growth and promoting tumor growth factors, which is kind of consistent with what we see in the research when you take out, organic non-processed soy versus this conventional stuff that you're finding and a lot of the food products. I would not be surprised as if more research comes out, we're going to see more issues with a lot of the meat alternatives that are coming out. So there are some limitations actually put out on scientists, which make this even more kind of ambiguous. And you can argue, depending on the route you take, that this is could be intentional. So scientists who study pesticides are actually limited in the kind of research they can conduct. So there's some ethics issues. So you can't give one group of people, a group of conventionally raised foods and one pesticide free. As great as that would sound, that's unethical because that could potentially be knowingly causing harm. So there's an ethical problem as to why you don't see some of these studies, or at least done on humans. Now in animals, uh, it's kind of a catch-22, right? Because animals do not necessarily have the same physiology as humans. It's not exactly the same with, say, rats and mice. Those tends to be the most, common animals we run these on. So it's kind of interesting because we can't do the RCT type studies on humans because they're unethical. And even though we only do it on animals, it's limited in terms of what it can do. So what we're stuck with is kind of epidemiological research, which again, you can only use correlation. You can't actually prove causation through, and that's kind of the trick of this whole game. So it's important to understand like where the scientists and why there is no science, not a lot of science that directly relates these two, because if you were to do those studies in a random control trials type setting, they would actually be considered unethical, which is kind of interesting if you think about it. Another limitation, so pesticides are usually regulated and studied um, by the effects of just the active agent. So what happens is they'll actually just test an active agent in a formulation, but not the whole formulation itself. Um, the claim by a lot of the companies is that these are just inert ingredients, but as we're going to get into, there's entourage effects that really play a role, and there's like no research on entourage effects, which is a really, really big issue when you're talking about pesticides, because when you're actually in practice in the real world, very few of these are used in, say, like you're getting one pesticide. They're usually a formula of multiple different types. And there is no research on that type of stuff as of right now. So that's important to keep in mind. Now, with that, so there's you get this compounding entourage type effect, which could be even worse. But again, if you go to the literature, it's just not going to be there. So as for the regulations that do exist, now they're not perfect. But if you are going for a USDA organic label, one thing it does do is prohibit the use of synthetic pesticides and a few other things. So anything synthetics out, any sort of sludge is not involved, especially if it's of a synthetic nature. That's not going to end up in at least organic, or at least USDA certified organic produce. So not perfect. USDA does not test for heavy metals, which is a whole separate issue. There has been, I guess, a growing concern on how like you can kind of buy your way into it, so to speak. But the best thing to do is going to be to, talk with local farmers, ask them about their practices and what they do, like actually try to build that relationship if you have the opportunity to. That's going to be kind of the most important and best thing you can do. Okay. Other studies, if that have been done on organic foods, again, more of an epidemiological type approach, but lower urinary levels of pesticides, better fertility, better birth outcomes, reduced incidence of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, which is something you saw again if you read the Monsanto papers. It's all about NHL. Lower BMI, reduced risk of type 2 diabetes. These are all with increased consumption of organic foods. So when it comes to the USDA, their goal um, is to test the pesticide residues found in food. Now, what's tricky here is like not all pesticides are tested, including glyphosate, which is interesting considering it's the most widely used pesticide in the US. So this is more when it comes to produce. It's different when it goes to like legumes and grains. It's a little bit different. And that's where kind of like these loopholes try to kind of come in. And that's where you can see how kind of people get around this a little bit. And this is interesting because these tests are commissioned by the EWG, or a test commissioned by the EWG, who were doing their own separate third-party testing, found that a lot of oat-based foods that are especially like popular with children, so a lot of cereals, they had pesticide residues that were higher than at least what the EWG, the Environmental Working Group, considers safe. So I would definitely check out the Environmental Working Group, the tests they're doing on things like glyphosate, because it's really, really important to kind of check that out and understand that, because you're not necessarily going to get that from the companies themselves. So really, really important to, be on top of that. Um, Interestingly, the responsibility of testing foods to determine dietary exposures to pesticides is actually split. So it's between the USDA and the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. But what's interesting is neither the USDA nor the FDA tests all commodities for pesticide residues, nor do the programs test for all pesticides that are commonly used. So they kind of separately test fruits and vegetables for pesticides, even though they both say that by and large testing shows that levels are almost always below legal limits. Research now shows that these are often too high. These limits are too high. They're kind of out of date, and they also don't take into account that if you're starting with kids, this is something you're introducing really early on, and it can be, again, an effect that kind of more exposures over time can kind of lead to bigger issues down the road. So really important to kind of take that into account here. Now, when it comes to pesticides, the registration process. So companies, when you register a pesticide, it has to submit safety data, and then what they have to say, what their uses are, what the product labels are going to be there for, and then the EPA checks this. Now, the crazy, crazy, crazy part about this is that the EPA does not actually do its own testing. So what happens is they actually don't do their own independent testing, which is kind of crazy. So, and neither, by the way, neither does its review fully capture the risk posed by pesticides because of their limitations in available data. So we talked about, it's tough to do those RCT types testing because of ethical issues, but they also don't include synergistic effects. So they're actually only testing kind of one thing at a time. So kind of important to keep in mind as you go. Now, what scientists have found is that, the combinations, when you have multiple pesticides used on a crop, that there are synergistic entourage effects, meaning that, if you're using two or more pesticides in a formulation, that could be more damaging than using one and two separate ones and on separate crops, if that makes any sense. So we know the EPA does not do its own testing. We know that they don't test the synergistic effects. It's not surprising that the U.S. Most toxic pesticides that we use here are actually not allowed in a lot of other countries. So It's kind of crazy. We're going to jump into kind of some of them here, some of the more common ones that Consumer Reports finds a little interesting. Now, this is going to be the link to this is actually going to be on YouTube. It's going to be in the description of this. So if you want to check out the report, you can check it out there. What they did find is nearly 70% of non-organic fresh produce sold in the US contains residues of potentially harmful chemical pesticides. No good. And what they found, according to a new Consumer Reports, they did an analysis of 5 years worth of data from the Department of Agriculture. They collected samples from different fruits and vegetables. They detected about 450 different pesticides. And in some cases, those levels exceeded what the Consumer Report sets as safe. So it's important to notice here that the FDA regulation levels tend to be a little bit higher than things like the Environmental Working Group and Consumer Reports, which take more into account children. And if it's not, going to be beneficial for children, generally it's not going to be beneficial for adult consumption either. So important to kind of keep that in mind. So, what did they find in here? They went to check that, like, in order to reduce pesticide exposure, they kind of wanted to, get an idea of what's good and what's going on. Obviously, organic isn't always possible. Almost half, what they did find is about almost half of all non organic fruits and vegetables pose little risk, but about 20% of them, especially things like green beans, peaches, potatoes, they received the worst scores compared to other fruits and vegetables. And this is consistent with what we find with the Environmental Working Group, why they have things like the Clean 15 Dirty Dozen that comes out yearly. Consumer Reports has kind of its own rating system that's worth knowing about as a consumer, because then you can make more informed decisions. If you can't purchase everything organic, there's certain things available that you can get away with maybe purchasing conventionally when it comes to pesticide use. So important to kind of keep that in mind. And especially, I want to say some of the produce that tends to come out the worst is usually like leafy greens. So think things like spinach, lettuces, stuff like that. Things that you tend to eat the whole thing of. Maybe you don't peel them. Maybe you don't do something like that. So spinach, leafy greens tend to show up generally pretty high on that list of pesticide residues. So want to go over a few of the more detrimental ones quickly that you may or may not have heard of. So the first one is acephate. So this can break down actually into a banned pesticide called methamidofos. Methamidofos. There we go. I write these down. Doing it live sometimes is an issue. This is actually was banned in 2009 because it's a known neurotoxin. It is toxic to the nervous system. This has been found in green beans, so that's kind of really troubling. It was found in about 10% of all samples. It also can be found in certain canned fruits and vegetables. So green beans, celery, summer squash, and sometimes even imported mangoes and watermelon if they're coming in from out of the country. Then there's chlorpyrifos, which is also spelled kind of strangely, but this is used to actually stop potatoes from sprouting. So interestingly, this is actually banned in the European Union because it's known to disrupt hormone production, especially, thyroid. So what's more disturbing is nearly every sample that they tested of non-organic U.S. potatoes, um, they had chlorpyrifos on them. They also found it on some organic potatoes, but the reason they found it was interesting because they actually used the same storage bins for the organic potatoes as the conventional ones. So they actually just kind of reused the bins, and that's where some of it got on there. So interesting, worth to kind of keep in mind. Then there's chlorpyrifos. A lot of these are tough names. Chlorpyrifos. So this was actually nearly banned in 2016. It's found usually on non-organic peaches. Excuse me, peaches. 2% of U.S. batches have them. 17% of imported do. do, and also you can find it on organic broccoli and grapes. Now, in 2017, lobbyists actually pushed that they needed more research before they could ban this, even though they knew that it targeted places like the respiratory system, the autonomic nervous system, the central nervous system. It could be absorbed through the skin and cause side effects like wheezing, salivation, nausea, vomiting, abdominal cramps, diarrhea, chest discomfort, sweating, pupil constriction, blurred vision, papilledema, which is inflammation in your optic nerve, uh, dermal irritation, muscle twitches, cyanosis, laryngeal spasms, and it could even be more severe. It could get to respiratory paralysis, convulsions, coma, lead to coma, loss of reflexes, loss of sphincter control, transient corneal injury, and superficial burns. So that is a long list of issues that you could kind of come along with when if you're exposed to these types of things. Then there's cyhalothrin. Now, this is thought to interfere with the neuromuscular system, so your nerves and your muscles, largely found in non-organic cherries. So, but it could also be found on things like kale in the U.S., lettuce, nectarines, tomatoes, spinach, imported lettuces, snap peas, tomatoes, and green beans. Then there's famoxidone, which research points to it being an endocrine disruptor, another hormone disruptor, like we talked about earlier. Consumer Reports, they're adamant that it shouldn't be used on foods without research, even though again there is stuff out there that says that this could potentially be dangerous. Then there's fludeoxonil. So it's actually a fungicide that's used after harvest, but it can disrupt endocrine, your endocrine system, your hormone system. So according to Consumers Report, they think that it's risky and can contribute to most risk in their analysis based on all the pesticides used. Now, again, we're not including glyphosate. We're going to get to that in a minute, but that's something that is kind of out there too. Now, they found this mostly on nectarines, peaches, and some imported fruits and vegetables that were non-organic. So important to kind of keep that in mind. Now, all of those that I listed, acephate, chlorpyrifos, chlorpyrifos, cyhalothrin, famoxidone, fludoxonil. That's for produce. When it comes to grains and beans, as we talked about earlier, that's going to be glyphosate Roundup. Now, you can obviously see this at home. You could find this in your home as Roundup. Now, even though they claim that it's going to be coming off store shelves soon, it's still going to be out there and cause a bit of an issue. Now, the reason being, it is thought to be a possible human carcinogen, a cancer-causing agent. This is done by the World Health Organization's International Agency for Cancer Research, the IARC. Even though, despite that, here in the U.S., we still spray it a ton on crops grown here. So, still an issue here, regardless, and that's kind of important to kind of keep in mind, when it comes to that. So, we'll talk about glyphosate next time. That's going to get its own kind of episode, but kind of want to give you like an idea of kind of where to go, what you can do. Again, the USDA does not test for all pesticides that are in use for crops. And you could find glyphosate in things that are like oats, which it's actually used as a drying agent. It's not even used really in the fields. It's used to actually dry oats out. So something kind of important to kind of keep in mind. It's So that's kind of what you get with it. Now, in terms of like things you can do, I'll link kind of the Queen 15 Dirty Dozen lists. They're going to be on this YouTube page. Also, will be the Consumer Reports article that a lot of this kind of came from. Next time, we'll talk about glyphosate. We'll talk about, some of the other things you can do to get there. But I hope that you kind of found this helpful. I'm trying to keep these short. I know this went like 25 minutes. This is a little long, but thank you for tuning in. Now, if you want, as you know, you can work with me. I obviously do consults online. So you can check that out on my website, insideouthealthwellness.com. If you're looking for, any other kind of direction and stuff, feel free to shoot me a DM. You could send something in the comments here on YouTube or on IG. and I'm more than happy to share this stuff. But I will be leaving this recording here on YouTube. Thank you for tuning in. This was a lot of fun. I will see you guys next time, and much love.